Good evening. We have reached perhaps one of the most pivotal points in mankind's ancient history. When we look at the book of Genesis, there are so many things that are significant, so many things that are incredibly important. Man's creation, the flood, Abraham taking those first steps. So many things that are incredibly important to our understanding of who we are and why we live the lives we live. But in Genesis chapter 21, we finally see the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham and Sarah. And this chapter, it's interesting for such an important moment in Genesis 21, for it to be such an important point that we would look at it, we would go, this is amazing, this is awesome. It's very underwhelming in the Bible's place for it. Ironically enough, it mirrors the birth of Christ, where the Bible does not put that much significance on his birth, comparatively to the life and ultimately the death. But what this chapter does do for us is it shows us God's faithfulness in man's problems. You see, mankind has problems. We all have problems in our life. We all have issues and situations that arise. And yet God's faithfulness to his promise, to mankind, to everything, overshadows all of this over and over and over. We want to take a little bit of time to look at this evening to show mankind's problems and how God, through his faithfulness, can overcome them. Genesis chapter 21, starting in verse 1, we see that promise is finally fulfilled. And the Lord visited Sarah as he said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. A very simple way of saying, and Sarah conceived and had a child named Isaac. You know, this is a point in which all parties are happy. You know, Abraham, he's thrilled. He's faithful to God. In verse 4, then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. God was faithful to Abraham. God was faithful to his promise, and Abraham was keeping his side. He's keeping the covenant. He took Isaac on the 8th day. He took him and he circumcised him. And then we see Sarah in a very interesting turn of events. Remember, we talked a few weeks ago about Sarah laughing. And how, there's something obviously there because God says, Sarah, why are you laughing? But here we see a reversal of that. In verses 6 through 7, and Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. She also said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age. Now this isn't criticism, this isn't argument, this is Sarah basically saying, look, God has shown himself faithful. And now everyone's going to laugh with me. It brings about the picture of Naomi, who, when she gets there, first she says everyone's going to be bitter, but by the end, she says, God has blessed me. Sarah recognizes God's faithfulness, and in that point in which she had laughed at God, she's now fully acknowledging that she laughed, basically. She says, now God has made me laugh with joy. And you can see Sarah's faithfulness, her acknowledgement of God, and her turning to God and saying, God, thank you for what you've done. That's the idea presented here. Everything is going great. Isaac is born. Abraham is obedient. Sarah is acknowledging God and acknowledging her own willingness to show faithfulness to God. And then everything goes downhill. Because with God's faithfulness, again, like I said, the second part of this is man's problems. And we see straight off there are going to be issues. In verse 9, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar, that is Ishmael. And Sarah saw Ishmael the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. We don't know exactly how much time has passed. It can't have been that long. But Ishmael looks at Isaac, looks at this promised child, and we see him scoffing. What did Isaac do? We don't know. Why is Ishmael being this way? We don't know. The Bible refers to him as a lad. But as I've mentioned before, that could be a wide range of ages. We can guess. We can go ahead and look up and see the year in which Ishmael was born, the year in which Isaac was born. He can't be that old. He's probably a very young boy at this time. But he looks. He's the firstborn, remember? And now he sees this competition and problems arise. So, a problem between Ishmael and Isaac. This is going to result in a problem between Sarah and Hagar. Sarah in verse 10 says, therefore she said to Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. It's interesting how quick it is. Sarah acknowledges her failure at laughing, and yet now that Ishmael is there, and remember, this is Sarah's doing as well, her anger is turned towards Abraham, her anger is turned towards Hagar, it's turned towards the young child Ishmael. Instead of stepping in, instead of telling Abraham, hey, look, you need to sort this out, you need to fix it, she goes, get rid of this problem. Get rid of her, get rid of the child. Says, this child will have no inheritance with my son. So now there is a problem. Ishmael, Isaac, Hagar, and Sarah, and technically Sarah and Abraham. Because in the next verse, verse 11, the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. And you can understand that. Abraham is Ishmael's father. No matter what else, no matter whatever situation arose, no matter how many problems there were, Ishmael is the son of Abraham. And he is a young boy. So the very idea of basically taking them out of a family that is influential, a family that is wealthy, a family that has been provided for by God over and over and over, and Sarah's saying, you get rid of them, that could very well be a death sentence. And it almost is. So when Sarah tells Abraham this, he in turn becomes mad. Do you see the mess that sprung up? All because a young boy shows contempt for Isaac? Mankind has problems. But God is faithful. God steps in. In verse 12, we see God speaking to Abraham, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. God says, don't worry about it. He continues and says, whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman because he is your seed. Now this is a point that we really need to consider. I have talked before about the reality that when God does something, he does it beyond our barest greatest imagination. God could have created an earth as plain and boring as anything, and yet he created it with vibrant colors, with thousands of plants and species. You know, I don't know if it's true, but I was listening to someone who, talking about animals, and I'm fairly certain they said there was like 12,000 species of ants. Ants. You know, if someone is fascinated by that, and they give thanks to God for his creation. God does everything big. And God made a promise to Abraham that he would become a mighty nation, that his descendants would be as the sand on the seashore. And because of that, because Ishmael is his child, we see at the very end of this, he tells Abraham, you don't worry, I'm going to be with this child because he is your seed. I will make him a great nation too. So Abraham, he's basically saying, look, I know that you're not happy with the situation. I know that you don't want to do this, but it's going to be okay because I will be with Ishmael. I will protect him and guide him. Do you understand that for Ishmael to be a mighty nation, he has to live to adulthood? For Ishmael to become a mighty nation, he has to have the wife, to have children, to provide this mighty group of people to rise. God says, through my providence, I will be with Ishmael every step of the way. He will be a mighty nation because he is your child. Because I made a promise to you, Abraham. That is the faithfulness of God. God, in his plan, in his purpose, says, I will give you a descendant, Isaac. Sarah says, well, God, let me help. Thus Ishmael is born, and God says, well, this is not what I wanted, but because he is your child, I will still be faithful to what I promised. Do you see how God goes above and beyond? That is the faithfulness of God. And in that faithfulness, the only response that we can have is faithfulness ourselves. In verse 14, Abraham shows faithfulness to God. So Abraham arose early in the morning, and he took bread and a skin of water, and he putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar, and he sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And you go, well, how is that faithful? Abraham did what God said. Abraham trusted in God. And on the tell of the events we see in chapter 20, the utter lack of trust, the utter lack of faith in God, this is a very refreshing change. Because here we see Abraham, who is unhappy, who is displeased, who's angry at Sarah, who's angry at Hagar, who's upset with the whole situation. When God says it's okay, take care of it, Abraham follows through and does what he's told to do. He shows trust that God will handle it. And then we see that God does. There's problems, there's trouble, there's issues. God steps in and our story suddenly takes a dramatic change. Starting in verse 15, we read, and the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bow shot. For she said to herself, let me not see the death of the boy. So she sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the lad. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, what ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. So God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. He dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife from him from the land of Egypt. God honors his promise to Abraham right off the bat. A wilderness, a young child who needs extra. The water skin runs dry pretty quick. They keep traveling. Finally, she is convinced that she is going to die. But what's worse, she's convinced that her son is about to die. And she goes, I can't watch it. She lays him down and she goes off to die. And God says, I'm with you. God keeps his promise. We see quite a bit about God. We see that God honors his promise in three ways. The original promise of a mighty nation, the renewed promise to Abraham, I will be with Ishmael here in chapter 21. And then throughout the chapter, throughout this entire scenario of 15 through 21, as he grows, God is with him. As he gets a wife, God is with him. As he makes sure that that promise comes to pass. And in the chapters to come, as we read more, we see that Ishmael becomes a mighty nation. God honors the promise to Abraham. We also see God showing compassion to the weak. Does it strike anybody odd that when she is crying, look at this, let's go back. The very beginning of this, the water's used up. She goes and says, let me not see the death of the boy. She sat opposite him, lifts up her voice, and she is weeping. But then look what God says. I heard the voice of the lad. The Bible doesn't mention anything about him crying. But God heard him. God heard the one whom he was promised to protect. God heard the innocent child. And God showed compassion on the weak. He shows compassion on Hagar, a woman who is distressed, a woman who is in utter despair. He brings her out of her own sorrow. He tells her, wake up, get up, it's all right, I'm going to be with you. But finally we see at the end of this, God opens her eyes. And perhaps this is the greatest thing for all of us to learn, is that when we follow God, God opens our eyes. Not in the miraculous sense such as this, not in the sense that we see with Balaam and the donkey, where finally Balaam's eyes are opened up and he sees the angel, or with Elisha and the men who are surrounding him, the chariots of fire. Not here, where it seems that this woman, suddenly her eyes are open and she goes, oh, there's water right there. When we follow God, he opens our eyes to truth. If we accept that God is our creator, if we accept that God is our sovereign Lord, we will be willing to accept truth. Our eyes will be open to it. God is faithful, and he will show us truth. Keep going. As you read through, and we're not going to read the rest of the chapter. It's 34 verses, I believe. Not significant, but a fair number. But as we keep reading, Abraham and Sarah become the topic of conversation again. In particular, Abraham and a man named Abimelech, the same Abimelech that had already had problems with Abraham. And now we see that, man, they are again talking, and God's not involved in this one. Abraham and Abimelech make a promise to each other. They make their own covenant, saying that our descendants will treat fairly with one another. Abraham stays in the land, and then there's a dispute that arises. He tells Abimelech, "Why have you people taken the well that I've dug?" There's some trading that goes on. There's a variety of things that take place. And I present this because I want to show you the very end of chapter 21. In verse 33, Abraham, at the end of all of this, when you look at this, you see verses 22 through 33, you go, well, God's not mentioned. Is Abraham doing this on his own? At the end of it, you see that God was always in the back of Abraham's mind. That he hadn't forgotten God. That all he did was in accordance to what God would have wanted him to do. In verse 33, then Abraham planted a terebinth tree in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. At the end of all he's done, Abraham worships God, the idea of calling upon the name of the Lord. I want you to understand something in the beginning of this. Abimelech acknowledges God. We know absolutely nothing about Abimelech, really. The Bible doesn't indicate that he was a follower of God prior to the episode we find in chapter 20. But God sure does scare him. And in chapter 21, Abraham, when speaking of Abimelech, Abraham's told, God is with you. God is guiding you, protecting you. He fully gives God all the credit for everything that Abraham has. And it shows us again that God's faithfulness towards us, when we have our problems, and we will have problems, the manner in which we hold ourselves will glorify God, and people will see God through our actions. In our problems, God's faithfulness is seen. This evening, we need to understand that God is always faithful. There are many times as we go throughout our life we struggle. There are many times that we wonder, is God? Give us 1 second. We need to remember the faithfulness of God. If you're here this evening, God has been faithful to you. What are you doing with that faithfulness? He was faithful in his creation. He was faithful in his sustaining of that creation. He was faithful in redeeming us from our own failures. how do you respond? If you've not been a child of God, if you haven't done what is necessary to be His child, then the sad reality is you have scorned the faithfulness of God. Make it right. Christ's faithfulness was seen in the death on the cross. Our faithfulness is seen in dying in the water grave of baptism, putting to death the old man, rising a new creature. If you are here this evening and you've not done that, then we encourage you to do what's necessary at this time. If you've done that in times past, but somewhere along the way you've stumbled off the course and you need help, you need the prayers of the church, you need the strength to turn back to God, and let us pray for you, let us help you, let us guide you in any way we can as we stand and as we sing.
I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's